The moon had just slipped behind clouds over Reynosa when gunshots cracked through the night air, sharp, relentless, a shattering score of chaos. Doors slammed. Children cried. From dusty alleyways came panicked footsteps. One taxi driver, still shaking, later said he saw masked men dragging someone from their home. Another witness, a shopkeeper, said glass exploded from windows, lighting up the street in flickers. And then, silence, except the drip of blood seeping under a door. No war had officially been declared. No announcement came that the city's fragile peace had collapsed. But this night would be remembered as the moment everything changed. Reynosa, once a border town defined by commerce, by everyday crossing of goods, people, hope, had become a battleground. Its streets had turned into front lines. The factions of the Gulf Cartel, especially Los Metros, Los Escorpions, Los Cyclones, carved up neighborhoods, eyes fixed on routes, bridges, checkpoints. On June 19, 2022, a massacre unlike any before overtook Reynosa. 15 civilians, masons, taxi drivers, nurses, students, were gunned down. Some had nothing to do with cartel business. Many had families, routines, a sunrise waiting for them. The official story would blame heating up the square, a brutal phrase meaning creating enough horror that law enforcement, federal forces, everyone hears the screams. But when you step into the shadows of what that square really is, you find blood, betrayal, and power struggles that stretch from dirty alleys into political offices. Then came the retaliation. The killing of Ernesto Vasquez Reyna, delegate of the Federal Attorney General's office, on a busy avenue in Reynosa, in full daylight. Gunmen, explosives, burning SUV. A message painted in fire. But even that did not fully reveal what lies beneath: the intercartel strife, the betrayals within factions, the disappearing names. Los Metros versus Los Cyclones. Los Escorpions stepping out of the shadows. Fragments of leaked videos, rumors of orders from leaders no one has publicly named, families who will not speak, but whose silence is louder than any gunshot. And so here we stand, at the edge of a story you may think you know, but you don't. Because this is not just about who pulled the trigger. It's about why. It's about how a city, caught between two nations, came to fracture. Over the next minutes, we'll go back, past the massacre, past the burning bridges, past the betrayals, to uncover the roots of this war. We'll hear from survivors, analysts, investigators. We'll show what the maps hide, what the official reports gloss over. Reynosa's streets have names. The families have faces. The blood has patterns. Because when silence falls in a border town, when fear fills the night, every broken window, every burned-out car, every life taken tells a part of the truth. Stay with me. Because to understand the battle for the border, you must see how it began, and why no amount of daylight could wash away what happened in the dark.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
The night of the massacre did not begin with warning. It began with the sound of trucks. Convoys, headlights dimmed, rolling through narrow streets. People peered through their curtains, whispering the same prayer: may they not stop here. May they not knock on our door. Then the crack of rifles, staccato bursts, the scream of tires skidding across asphalt. Inside a modest home, a mother pulled her children under the bed. A taxi driver parked his car and crouched behind it, clutching a small cross. In the distance, a church bell rang, not for prayer, but because the tower shook as bullets ripped into nearby walls. The assault was not random. These were coordinated strikes. Homes, shops, and even parked cars became targets. Civilians who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time paid the price. When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire itself. For a moment, it felt as though the city had lost its breath. But to understand Reynosa's bloodbath, We cannot stay in this night alone. We must step back. Step into daylight. Into a city that, on the surface, looked like any other hard-working border town. Reynosa was a place of factories, maquiladoras churning out goods for the United States, trucks lined up for export, families working shifts across the Rio Grande. The border itself was both lifeline and curse. Every day, thousands crossed legally, workers, students, families. Every day, others crossed in shadows, smugglers with hidden cargo, coyotes guiding migrants through brush, scouts reporting to armed men waiting in the city. Reynosa was the gateway. Whoever controlled Reynosa controlled the artery to the north. In the plazas, life seemed ordinary. Children played soccer on cracked pavement. Vendors sold tacos from roadside stands. Couples strolled hand in hand through the markets. Yet even here, shadows stretched long. A spray-painted symbol on a wall marked which faction ruled that block. A missing poster with a young woman's face fluttered in the breeze. Locals lowered their voices when strangers walked by. Everyone knew the unwritten rules: do not look too long at the wrong car. Do not ask what is being loaded into a truck after midnight. Do not talk too loudly about who disappeared last week. Life continued, but it was a fragile performance, a dance on the edge of silence and fear. Factories employed thousands, but wages barely kept families afloat. For some, temptation grew. A nephew suddenly driving a new pickup. A cousin flashing wads of cash after a job no one dared ask about. In Reynosa, poverty and opportunity twisted together, each shadow offering both escape and danger. And while families tried to live ordinary lives, the city itself was already divided. Each bridge, each road, each colonia had an owner. Cartel factions carved Reynosa into invisible borders. Cross the wrong street, and you crossed into someone else's war. For the uninitiated, Reynosa looked ordinary, just another city under the sun. But beneath the ordinary, beneath the busy highways and laughter of children, something darker pulsed. The blood that would soon stain Reynosa was not spilled without reason. This was a city already claimed. Its streets were not free. They were marked, watched, and owned long before the gunfire of that night. Reynosa looked ordinary, but its streets were already claimed. Before the city bled under his rule, before his name was whispered with fear, he was just a boy. A boy born into hunger, into streets that offered no refuge, into a family that worked hard but earned too little. His first memories were not of school or games, but of scarcity. Empty plates. Bare feet. And a constant reminder: survival meant sacrifice. He learned quickly that hunger sharpened ambition. While other children dreamed of toys, he dreamed of money, of never hearing his mother apologize for an empty pot again. His first theft was small, a stolen loaf of bread from a vendor's stand. His second, bolder, slipping into parked cars and stealing radios. Each act carved him deeper into the shadows, each step further from innocence. By his mid-teens, the streets had already claimed him. He ran with older boys, delivering small packages, messages coded in whispers. It wasn't long before he was carrying more than letters, before his hands gripped steel. His first weapon was not a gun, but a rusted machete passed down by someone who told him, "This is how you earn respect." Trouble was inevitable. One night, a deal went wrong. Sirens pierced the darkness. He was arrested, tried as a minor, and thrown into a prison that was less a place of punishment and more a training ground for crime. Behind those walls, the boy met men who would shape his destiny. Hardened killers. Drug traffickers. Smugglers who controlled networks beyond imagination. Prison was not his downfall, it was his university. Charisma became his greatest weapon. He listened. He learned. He adapted. Where others survived in silence, he thrived in conversation. He charmed the old guard, earned protection, and watched carefully how power moved. Violence opened doors, but respect kept them open. By the time his sentence ended, he walked out not as a boy, but as a man with connections, promises, and a vision. Back in Reynosa, his rise was swift. He was fearless, willing to do what others hesitated to. A single act of ruthless violence secured his reputation. Rival dealers disappeared. Debt collectors who defied him were found as warnings in the streets. Yet beneath the brutality was a strange magnetism. Men followed him not only out of fear, but out of loyalty. He had the rare gift of making them believe they were part of something bigger. As months turned into years, he built his empire brick by brick. Factories and border bridges became his chessboard. He taxed every load that crossed his city, legal or illegal. He recruited not only street soldiers but also businessmen, police officers, and politicians who preferred bribes over bullets. The city began to bend around him. Reynosa was no longer just a town on the border, it was his kingdom. The people of Reynosa learned his name, though most never spoke it out loud. For some, he was a provider, handing out food baskets, paying for school uniforms, even covering funeral costs. For others, he was a monster, responsible for disappearances, bodies left in canals, neighbors who never came home again. He was both savior and executioner, depending on which side of his empire you stood. With every year, his grip tightened. Bars, nightclubs, and markets paid him silently. Truck drivers crossed themselves before entering Reynosa, knowing whose blessing they needed. Rivals either bent the knee or bled out in the streets. It seemed unstoppable. It seemed eternal. He had risen from the dust of poverty to the throne of power, and the city bowed. But in the world of cartels, no empire lasts forever. Power is a crown made of glass, it cuts the one who wears it, and it draws the gaze of those who want it. Behind his growing shadow, whispers already spread. Other factions. Other leaders. Other hungry men. His throne was strong, but it was not secure. But power never stays unchallenged for long. Across the borderlands, whispers traveled faster than bullets. While Reynosa bent under the rule of one man, others watched, jealous, hungry, and ready to strike. In a world where power is never shared, the rise of a kingpin does not inspire admiration. It invites rivals. And in the darkness, another faction stirred, waiting for their chance to claim the city. Their story began not in Reynosa, but in the mountains, where generations had lived off the drug trade long before cartels were even named. Smugglers turned warlords, warlords turned businessmen, and businessmen turned killers. For them, Reynosa was not just another city, it was a gold mine. The bridges, the highways, the factories, all were arteries of wealth. And to them, that wealth was stolen. They wanted it back. But greed was not their only fuel. Revenge burned hotter. Years before, a bloody feud had left dozens of their men dead, slaughtered in an ambush ordered by the kingpin of Reynosa. Families buried their sons, mothers wept over sealed coffins, and the faction swore an oath, one day, they would return the favor in blood. Unlike the charisma of Reynosa's ruler, the rival faction's leader was pure fire. Brutal, uncompromising, and unpredictable. Where the kingpin built loyalty with charm and cunning, this man ruled with fear. His philosophy was simple: strike first, strike hard, and let the corpses send the message. Soldiers followed him not because they believed in him, but because to disobey meant death. Their entry into Reynosa was not subtle. Convoys of blacked-out SUVs roared into the outskirts, engines snarling like predators. Their first move, ambush. A loyal lieutenant of the kingpin was dragged from his car, executed in broad daylight, and left in the middle of a busy intersection. A message scrawled on cardboard lay across the body: "We are here." Fear became a weapon as powerful as any gun. The rivals plastered the city with graffiti, threats painted in red on school walls, warnings sprayed across abandoned factories. They spread propaganda through narco banners, taunting the kingpin, daring him to respond. Reynosa, once a city of whispers, now echoed with open defiance. Each night, the war crept closer. Gunfire rattled through neighborhoods, leaving shattered glass and bullet-riddled walls. Executions became a spectacle, bodies hung from bridges at dawn as warnings. The message was clear: the old king no longer ruled unchallenged. A new power demanded recognition. But the kingpin would not bend. His men retaliated with equal brutality. Ambushes answered ambushes. Drive-by shootings became common, each side trying to outdo the other in savagery. Streets turned into chessboards of blood, where every corner could hide death. Families learned to dive at the first sound of gunfire, children learned to identify calibers by sound, and Reynosa's nights became sleepless. Still, the rival faction grew bolder. They infiltrated the police, bribed commanders, and paid journalists to spread fear with sensational headlines. Even within the kingpin's ranks, betrayal simmered. The rivals' promise was simple: switch sides now, or die later. And some listened. Soldiers once loyal began disappearing, only to resurface flying a new banner. By the summer, the city was no longer a city. It was a battlefield. Every street corner, every market stall, every bridge became contested ground. The people of Reynosa did not wake to peace, they woke to war. A war where the lines between enemy and ally blurred, where survival meant obedience to whichever cartel controlled your block that day. And in the middle of it all, Reynosa itself became the ultimate prize. The city became the prize in a war without rules. War is not just fought between soldiers. In Reynosa, the battlefield was every street, every market, every school. While cartels plotted ambushes and executions, ordinary families tried to live, caught between two wars they never chose. The morning alarm still rang, children still needed breakfast, shops still had to open. But each sunrise carried a question that haunted everyone: will we survive today? For teachers, the classroom was no longer a safe haven. One woman, Senora Ramirez, taught mathematics in a school just 3 blocks from a cartel-controlled street. She carried chalk in her bag, but also a rehearsed evacuation plan. At the first sound of gunfire, her students knew to drop to the floor, to crawl away from windows, to wait in silence. Lessons in fractions were interrupted by lessons in survival. In the marketplace, a shopkeeper named Jorge unlocked his stall every morning with trembling hands. His fruit stand was once filled with laughter and bargaining, now it stood in the shadow of extortion. Each week, masked men came for la quota, the tax. Refuse, and you risk your life. Pay, and you live another day. Jorge paid, though it meant his family ate less. He sold oranges under the weight of fear, smiling at customers while his heart raced at the sound of every approaching motorcycle. Taxi drivers too lived on borrowed time. For Luis, the streets of Reynosa were both his livelihood and his death trap. Every fare carried danger. Was this passenger a frightened local, or a lookout for the rival faction? Which route was safe today? Which block was suddenly controlled by another cartel? His rearview mirror reflected more than traffic, it reflected suspicion, fear, and the constant question of trust. Families built survival strategies the way others built routines. Mothers memorized which streets were safe on Mondays, which markets were too dangerous on Fridays, which neighborhoods belonged to which cartel after dark. Fathers taught children to never answer the door, to never linger outside after sunset. Even crossing the wrong intersection could mean never coming home. Trust became currency. Neighbors whispered warnings: don't go down Calle Bravo today, there's been trouble. Taxi drivers radioed one another: avoid the plaza, shooting just started. Even churches, once sanctuaries, became places where people exchanged hushed survival tips. The city was alive with secrets, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, like fragile lifelines in a sea of violence. Yet even with rules of survival, no one was untouchable. Children disappeared on their way to school. Shopkeepers vanished after refusing payments. Taxi drivers were found abandoned, their cars riddled with bullets. Death was random, merciless, and silent. Reynosa became a place where you never knew if your last goodbye in the morning truly was your last. The city adapted in strange ways. Streets emptied at nightfall. Birthday parties were celebrated in basements instead of courtyards. Fireworks were banned, not by law, but by fear. No one wanted the crack of celebration mistaken for the crack of gunfire. Ordinary life shrank into shadows, a pale reflection of what it once was. For some, hope still lingered. Senora Ramirez still opened her classroom each morning. Jorge still sold his fruit. Luis still picked up passengers. The resilience of Reynosa's people was stubborn, unyielding. They clung to normalcy, even when normalcy had been shattered. But no amount of courage could change the truth. A storm was coming, and the fragile rules of survival were about to collapse. Because one night, the war that hid in whispers and shadows broke free into the open. Convoys rolled in. Gunfire didn't fade after a few bursts, it raged. And the streets where families had survived by rules and routines became battlefields where no rule applied. But the rules of survival collapsed the moment war came to the open streets. At the heart of Reynosa's war was not pride, nor revenge, it was money. The city sat astride smuggling routes worth billions each year. Drugs moved north, cash flowed south, and every shipment was a vein of gold for whoever controlled it. Cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana all converged on this border, destined for the American market. Each kilo was profit. Each truckload was power. The highways became lifelines. Federal Highway 40, the lifeblood of trade, turned into a chessboard of ambushes. Checkpoints once guarded by police now became toll booths for cartels. Soldiers in camouflage manned some posts, but even they could not be trusted. Sometimes they waved shipments through for bribes, other times they vanished when convoys approached. For the cartels, every bridge, every overpass, every strip of asphalt was territory to be won. Billions meant desperation. The rival faction had grown bold, seizing routes along the eastern edges of the city. They taxed truckers, hijacked shipments, and slaughtered couriers who resisted. The kingpin's empire felt the cut in revenue. To him, this wasn't just an insult, it was war. The smuggling routes were his veins, and someone was draining them. The streets of Reynosa became maps of danger. Taxi drivers whispered which checkpoints belonged to which faction. Shopkeepers marked delivery routes based on who controlled them that week. For ordinary families, the war for highways meant constant shortages. Milk disappeared from stores, medicine prices doubled, and trucks carrying goods vanished before reaching markets. Then came the mistake. One night, a major smuggling convoy slipped through an unguarded route. The rival faction thought it secured their dominance. But to the kingpin, it was an unforgivable breach. It wasn't just about losing drugs, it was about losing face. In cartel logic, reputation is currency. And when reputation bleeds, leaders bleed with it. The kingpin's retaliation was immediate. Orders spread like wildfire, no more whispers, no more warnings. Every rival convoy was to be stopped, every safe house raided, every sympathizer executed. His men were unleashed with the fury of an army betrayed. For weeks, Reynosa simmered like a pot ready to boil over, the sound of distant gunfire echoing each night. Tensions erupted at checkpoints. Trucks were pulled over, drivers dragged out, cargo set ablaze on the asphalt. Gunmen manned intersections in broad daylight, their rifles daring the rivals to approach. The highways became death traps, where a single wrong turn meant never being seen again. Reynosa, once a city of factories and markets, now looked like a military zone. Yet neither side backed down. For the rivals, seizing Reynosa was destiny. For the kingpin, holding it was survival. Every peso, every shipment, every life was wagered on the war for control. All it needed was a spark, one strike too bold, one attack too brazen, to ignite the firestorm everyone feared. That spark came in broad daylight. A rival convoy, overconfident after weeks of unchecked movements, attempted to pass through the city center. It was supposed to be routine, a show of dominance. But what awaited them was no checkpoint, no toll booth, only an ambush. The streets erupted with fire. In seconds, the invisible war became visible. Shoppers dropped their bags, cars were abandoned in intersections, and blood pooled on asphalt where moments before life had seemed almost normal. It was no longer whispers or graffiti, it was war, naked and merciless, played out under the unforgiving sun. Then, in broad daylight, the first massacre began. The city had already been breathing the smoke of tension for weeks, but that night the air itself seemed to ignite. It began before midnight, not with confusion, but with precision. Locals later told reporters that convoys of blacked-out pickups and SUVs moved into position like pieces on a chessboard, 3 vehicles at each entrance to a neighborhood, 2 blocking the main avenue, others slipping into side streets to cut escape routes. It was not chaotic, it was choreography. Authorities later described an operation that looked planned and practiced, a single, devastating strike designed to paralyze an area and make a spectacle of violence. Witnesses would say, again and again, that the first sounds were not just gunfire but a pattern, rapid bursts meant to terrify, then pauses long enough for panic to spread, then another volley to finish the terror. One survivor described it as a drumbeat of metal and fear, bursts, silence, then human screams that filled the alleys. Mothers pulled children under beds, drivers abandoned cars and ran into courtyards, shopkeepers crouched among shelves and tried to whisper reassurances that felt thin as paper. Those testimonies, collected by reporters and NGOs, paint the human rhythm of the attack. Insurgent precision met civilian chaos. In several places, attackers used fire as both weapon and signal. Eyewitnesses told of pickup trucks pushed across intersections then set alight to create barricades. A burning vehicle became a moving wall of flame that choked escape routes and lit the street like a homing beacon for more assailants. Flames licked storefronts and black smoke coiled into the night sky. When the smoke cleared, neighborhoods that had been ordinary markets and living rooms looked like the aftermath of a storm. These burning barricades were not incidental, they were tactical, designed to isolate and control. The convoys didn't just shoot and move. They swept. Teams fanned out to search houses, forcing doors, dragging people into the street. Some residents who later spoke to journalists said men in tactical clothing knocked on doors and demanded names. When a name did not satisfy them, they executed the decision on the pavement. Other teams focused on public places, plazas, bus stops, corners where life gathered. That method, to hit both homes and common spaces, turned every inch of the city into a potential hazard. Public squares that had been for coffee and conversation became counting rooms for terror. As the assault unfolded, survivors became chroniclers. A taxi driver who escaped told a regional reporter how he watched 2 men drag a shopkeeper from his stall while another group ransacked the register and set fire to the awning. A mother recounted dragging her infant through a back alley, the infant's small body muffled by her coat as they ran past fires and shards of glass. These human accounts, grainy, terrified, unadorned, are the mosaic that reconstructs what the cameras often missed. They tell us how ordinary people were swept into extraordinary violence. In the center of the assault, the attackers controlled information as much as territory. Phones cut out, mobile signals were jammed in pockets. Eyewitness video that did surface was often blurred and quickly removed or suppressed. Official channels responded with rapid, sterile statements that an operation had been underway, that arrests were forthcoming, that criminals had been neutralized. But on the streets, the count was different. Relatives spoke of missing loved ones whose names did not appear on any early lists. Local activists and community groups began compiling their own tallies, arguing that official numbers could not, capture the full toll. Medical volunteers later described hospitals that night overflowing with wounds that did not match the neatness of official briefings. Surgeons told reporters that bodies arrived with multiple entry wounds. Ambulances reported being blocked at choke points, forced to wait while gunmen argued over routes. In some cases, locals said, ambulances were attacked or diverted. The result was a confusion of counts, bodies processed here, missing people reported there, names that haunted family groups but never made it into the mourning roll of official casualties. Independent investigators and human rights organizations began to question whether the public told the whole story. In the days that followed, the city discovered other traces of the night, burned license plates, shell casings stamped with multiple calibers, and the same brand of tactical gloves left scattered like signatures. Forensic teams found patterns, the angles of bullets, clusters of impact, the locations where vehicles were torched, that suggested a coordinated plan rather than an opportunistic rampage. Analysts would later map those patterns to show which cells were operating where, and how the assault moved through Reynosa in a clean, surgical manner. that mapping became part of the painful ledger of that night. Yet even as experts pieced together tactics and routes, families searched for names. Some counted dead, others counted missing. Official briefings cited a number of fatalities, figures that came from authorities who said they had detained alleged perpetrators and were following leads. Community groups insisted the number was higher, that many had been taken and never seen again. This gap between the government's numbers and what local neighborhoods had lived through would become a wound in itself, a public discrepancy that many viewed as a failure to fully name the cost of the violence. When the smoke finally thinned, the community counted not just bodies but the damage to daily life, routes that would never be considered safe again, markets that shuttered permanently, schoolchildren who refused to return to classes for months. The night of fire did not merely kill, it rewired how people moved, who they trusted, and what they were willing to risk. And perhaps worst of all, the official ledger would never fully match the memories etched into the city's streets and the silence of those who still waited for someone to answer a missing name. The government's numbers didn't match the blood on the streets. In the hours after the night of fire, Reynosa was not just a city in shock, it was a city in silence. But it wasn't the silence of mourning, it was the silence of suppression. Local media outlets received phone calls before sunrise, warning them to stick to the official line. Journalists were told to print only what was read at the government press conference, that the violence was contained, the casualties minimal, and suspects already in custody. Anything more, they were warned, would be treated as collaboration with the enemy. The first official police report listed fewer than 24 dead. But locals whispered higher numbers, far higher. Residents counted funerals that exceeded the government's tally, and neighbors swapped stories about missing men and women who never made it onto any casualty list. Families went to police stations asking for answers, only to be met with stone-faced denials. There is no record, they were told. Some mothers carried photographs of sons and daughters into those offices and walked out with nothing but silence. Reporters who tried to dig deeper soon faced their own threats. In Reynosa, as in much of Tamaulipas, journalism was a deadly profession. Editors received anonymous text messages warning them to respect the figures or risk becoming a headline themselves. Entire newspapers blacked out coverage, publishing blank pages where crime stories should have been, a silent protest against the impossible choice between truth and survival. To outsiders it looked like negligence, to insiders it was self-preservation. Families too were silenced. Some were approached by strangers offering advice not to pursue missing persons cases. Others received phone calls late at night, voices that never identified themselves but promised consequences if the search continued. The effect was chilling, grief that could not be spoken aloud, questions that could not be asked, and a community forced to mourn in shadows. The missing became ghosts long before their names could ever be recorded. In this vacuum, social media became the only crack where light could enter. On WhatsApp groups and Twitter threads, shaky cell phone clips began to circulate, footage of burning trucks, of masked gunmen moving through intersections, of screams cutting through the night. These clips often vanished as quickly as they appeared, sometimes deleted by terrified uploaders, sometimes scrubbed by automated systems. But for those few hours when they survived online, they contradicted everything the official story tried to impose. Each leaked video became a digital spark, igniting rumors and forcing officials into uncomfortable denials. Police spokesmen dismissed them as misinformation, while federal authorities insisted the situation was under control. But the gap between what people had lived and what they were being told grew wider with each denial. Social media didn't just share images, it became the battleground for credibility itself. Some journalists found clever ways to push back. Instead of publishing direct accusations, they ran coded stories, obituaries filled with unusual detail, editorials about storms and shadows that everyone in Reynosa understood were about the massacre. These were breadcrumbs left in public view, a way of documenting without naming. It was storytelling under siege, survival by metaphor. But suppression has limits. With every funeral, every whispered testimony, the weight of silence became impossible to carry. Activists began keeping their own ledgers, listing names of the dead and missing, sharing them in hushed meetings and encrypted chats. These lists painted a bloodier picture than the official version: dozens unaccounted for, entire families fractured, names that should have been headlines but were instead confined to hand-scribbled notes. The turning point came when a journalist received an audio file from an anonymous source. It was a leaked recording, a conversation between men with clipped, authoritative voices, discussing movements of convoys and targets. The chilling part wasn't just the language of command. It was the suggestion, between the lines, that orders hadn't come from the streets at all, but from someone higher. The recording circulated quietly, then widely, despite efforts to bury it. And once it was heard, there was no one hearing it. The massacre itself had left Reynosa in ruins, but the leak pointed to something more dangerous: complicity. Not just cartels acting alone, but chains of command that blurred into officialdom. For families, the horror deepened. It wasn't just the killers they had to fear, but the possibility that the very authorities tasked with protecting them were orchestrating the violence from above. Then a single leaked recording revealed who gave the order. Reynosa didn't heal in the weeks after the massacre. It bled quietly. Streets once alive with music and commerce fell into silence at dusk. Curfews, both official and unspoken, spread across neighborhoods. By nightfall, entire blocks were empty. Corner shops closed early, taxis stopped running, and families bolted their doors before the sun disappeared. To walk after dark was to risk vanishing, another name whispered into the long, unfinished list of the missing. Markets that once served thousands a day now stood half-empty, stalls covered with tarps, vendors glancing nervously at the clock. Even schools shrank into shells of themselves, attendance plummeted, teachers whispered warnings to students, and children carried anxiety in their backpacks alongside books. Life hadn't stopped, but it had shrunk, as if the whole city were holding its breath, waiting for another eruption. While fear paralyzed most of the city, one person refused to stay silent. An investigative journalist, young, sharp, stubborn, began piecing together fragments of truth. She gathered testimonies from survivors, cross-referenced official numbers with local funeral records, and studied hours of shaky footage smuggled out by terrified residents. Her notes grew into a map of contradictions. Where authorities claimed peace, her evidence showed destruction. Where officials claimed low casualties, her tally suggested dozens more. Each lead carried danger. Sources spoke only in whispers, in back rooms, or over encrypted apps that disappeared messages within minutes. Families trembled as they gave her names, terrified of the consequences. She met one mother in a church, the woman clutching a rosary as she described how her son had vanished. She met a shopkeeper behind a shuttered stall who slid her a list of missing coworkers. Every note she added to her journal made her a bigger target. The threats came quickly. First, anonymous calls to her phone, dropped the story. Then, envelopes slipped under her door containing photographs of her walking home, each one marked with an X. Journalists in Tamaulipas had been silenced before, by fear, by bribes, by bullets. She knew the risk. But something in her resolve hardened. If the truth died here, it might never surface at all. Then, late one night, her encrypted inbox lit up with a message from an unknown sender. Attached was a video file, grainy, time-stamped, and more damning than anything she had collected so far. She pressed play, and her blood ran cold. The footage showed masked men, but not all of them were strangers. Some had their masks off, their faces clearly visible, their voices captured as they barked orders. And behind them, in a dim room, sat men in uniforms. She replayed the clip again and again, slowing it frame by frame, jotting names beside the faces she recognized. These weren't just cartel foot soldiers. They were men who, days earlier, had appeared at press conferences as protectors. One even stood shoulder to shoulder with state officials, assuring the public that Reynosa was safe. The video exposed the double face of power, killers at night, spokesmen by day. By morning, she had connected 3 of the men to documented government posts. 2 worked in law enforcement, another was rumored to be linked to a regional commander. This was no longer about rival gangs tearing a city apart, it was evidence of collusion at the highest levels. If she published, it would shatter the official narrative. It could also shatter her life. Still, she knew she couldn't keep it to herself. She made copies, encrypted drives, cloud backups, one even hidden in a book beneath her bed. But every safeguard reminded her of the cost. To reveal the truth meant drawing a target so bright it could not be ignored. Friends urged her to leave Reynosa, to vanish before it was too late. She ignored them. Something told her the story had to be told, but at what price? As she drafted her article, her hands shook on the keyboard. She could already hear the echoes of retribution, already picture the men who would want her silenced. Yet her duty weighed heavier than her fear. She stared at the screen, the headline blinking at her in defiance of everything she'd been warned not to do. Her cursor hovered, ready to publish, and then she stopped. What she discovered was too explosive to publish safely. Days after the journalist received the explosive video, the government staged its response. Cameras were summoned, microphones lined up, and officials walked to podiums with rehearsed solemnity. One by one, they paraded suspects before the public, men in handcuffs, their faces bowed as flashbulbs flared. Authorities declared the operation a victory. "These are the perpetrators of the Reynosa massacre," the spokesman announced, as if the story had reached its conclusion. But in Reynosa, the streets whispered something different. The faces shown on television didn't match the ones people had seen that night. Residents remembered taller figures, specific tattoos, voices that commanded fear. The men in custody looked more like scapegoats than masterminds. Some locals whispered that they were poor migrants, rounded up to fill a quota, offered deals they couldn't refuse, take the blame, in your family lives. On social media, skeptics began comparing mugshots to eyewitness sketches, pointing out glaring differences. The official narrative began to crack at the edges. Journalists pressed for details. Reporters asked where the arrests had taken place, what evidence tied these men to the attacks. The answers were vague: an anonymous tip, ongoing investigations, confidential intelligence. When pressed, officials dodged. Instead, they leaned harder on the spectacle, uniforms, badges, and the illusion of control. Justice was not being served, it was being staged. Behind the curtain, forensic teams were finding evidence that didn't fit the narrative. In rural stretches just outside Reynosa, investigators stumbled upon shallow graves. Bodies, hastily buried, bore bullet wounds that didn't match the calibers listed in the official report. Forensic markers showed patterns, execution-style shots, groups of victims killed in clusters. These details contradicted the government's neat story of a firefight with criminals. This wasn't a battle, it was a purge. Ballistic experts ran tests on casings collected in Reynosa. They found inconsistencies. Some shells matched weapons seized from cartel stash houses, but others bore signatures from police-issue rifles. These results were quietly filed away, never mentioned in public briefings. Insiders later leaked that certain reports were edited or disappeared entirely. The chain of evidence was broken, and with it, the hope of honest accountability. Families of the victims demanded answers. They staged small, defiant protests outside government buildings, carrying photographs of their loved ones and chanting names into the air. But authorities responded with indifference, sometimes even hostility. Police dispersed vigils, claiming they were unauthorized gatherings. To grieve publicly became an act of resistance. Mothers cried not only for the dead but for the truth that seemed forever buried. The arrested suspects, meanwhile, appeared in court. Some sat dazed, others trembling, as prosecutors read charges of homicide, terrorism, and organized crime. Yet as their cases unfolded, inconsistencies piled higher. Defense lawyers revealed alibis. One man was reportedly hundreds of miles away on the night of the massacre. Another's fingerprints didn't appear on any seized weapon. But in a system where convictions mattered more than accuracy, such contradictions were brushed aside. Meanwhile, whispers spread through Reynosa of other suspects who were never named, never shown. Men with known ties to powerful figures seemed untouched by the wave of arrests. One local priest, speaking cautiously, remarked, "The wrong men are behind bars. The guilty ones are protected." His words captured what many already suspected, that this was not justice, but theater. Independent investigators tried to push the truth into daylight. NGOs filed reports highlighting the forensic inconsistencies, demanding accountability for the missing. Yet their calls rarely made headlines. Too often, articles vanished before publication, or editors pulled stories at the last second. Behind the scenes, the pressure to maintain the illusion of order remained relentless. The deeper one looked, the more obvious the performance became. For Reynosa, the parade of suspects and official pronouncements brought no closure. If anything, it deepened the wound. The city had witnessed a massacre, but the story being told was a lie. And those who dared to expose the truth faced the same silence, the same shadowy threats, the same machinery of cover-up that had buried so many before. The real mastermind was still free, and protected. Night falls over Reynosa, and silence settles where chaos once roared. In the corners of battered neighborhoods, families gather with trembling hands and broken voices. They light candles at makeshift memorials, on sidewalks, at bus stops, at the very intersections where blood once stained the pavement. Each flame flickers not only for the dead, but for the truth that refuses to die with them. In schoolyards once filled with children's laughter, swings now creak aimlessly in the wind. Boards cover windows where classrooms once opened to sunlight. Teachers, shopkeepers, drivers, those who survived, lock their doors earlier than ever, whispering prayers over radios tuned low. Entire blocks stand abandoned, as if the city itself has forgotten how to breathe. A survivor's voice cracks the stillness. We live, but it's not life. Every knock at the door, every engine in the distance, feels like the war starting again. Another whispers through tears, the streets are haunted. You see shadows, and you don't know if they're ghosts, or gunmen. Their words hang heavy, etched into the silence like scars carved into the city's skin. Journalists who dared to dig deeper uncovered a final betrayal, a revelation that shattered even hardened investigators. Leaked documents revealed that the spark of the Reynosa bloodbath wasn't just cartel greed or street-level revenge. It was a deal gone sour, orchestrated by men in suits, far above the gunmen who pulled the triggers. Political promises broken, money redirected, loyalties sold. And when the betrayal surfaced, the streets paid the price. The massacre wasn't spontaneous. It was engineered, a bloody message, funded and approved behind closed doors. Forensic inconsistencies, false suspects, silenced journalists, all threads weaving into a single truth. Reynosa was sacrificed, its people turned into pawns in a battle for profit and power. Yet even in silence, the city resists forgetting. Mothers still gather in church pews, their candles dripping wax onto worn wooden floors. Fathers visit unmarked graves, whispering names so they are not lost. Children grow up hearing stories not from history books, but from the trembling voices of survivors who refuse to let the truth vanish into darkness. International eyes glanced briefly at Reynosa, then moved on. Headlines faded, cameras left, officials returned to routine speeches. But for those who live here, the echoes remain. They linger in every empty storefront, every burned-out car left rusting on the roadside, every silence that falls too heavy at night. Survivors tell their stories cautiously, in whispers, as if words themselves are dangerous. One man leans close to the recorder and says, "You think you're safe when the shooting stops." But the silence is worse. In silence, you hear the deals being made, the ones that decide who dies next. The betrayal that triggered the massacre is known now, at least in fragments, enough to show the contours of a larger, hidden war. A war where governments, cartels, and shadows in between decide the fate of cities like Reynosa. A war where justice is a costume, truth is a casualty, and silence is the only survivor. And so, we arrive at the truth's cruelest twist: it was never meant to be known. Every buried report, every silenced voice, every candle burning against the wind tells us so. And yet, here we are, piecing it together, shard by shard, name by name, grave by grave. The bloodbath in Reynosa wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a silence that still speaks. The truth was never meant to be known, and yet, here we are, piecing it together. Reynosa's story is not just a tragedy of one city, it's a warning. A warning about silence, about corruption, about borders where the war never ends. And though justice has been delayed, and the masterminds still walk free, the names of the lost are not forgotten. Their voices echo in every streetlight that flickers, in every border crossing that hides another secret. If this story moved you, don't let it vanish into silence. Share it. Comment with your thoughts. And subscribe, because there are more hidden wars, more stories they don't want you to hear, and we will bring them to light, together.